The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace, where Prince Alexander had lived his entire 12 years. The palace walls, decorated with golden tapestries and paintings of his ancestors, had always felt more like a beautiful prison than a home. Today was different, though. Today something would happen that would change everything. Prince Alexander was not like other royal children. While his tutors expected him to focus on languages, mathematics, and royal protocol, his mind often wandered to the servants who cleaned his rooms, the guards who stood at attention for hours, and the kitchen staff who prepared his meals. He noticed things that others in his position rarely saw. The kingdom of Valdoria was known throughout the land for its strict traditions. The royal family followed ancient rules that had been passed down for centuries. One of the most important rules was that royalty should never interact directly with the palace staff beyond giving orders. The royal guard, in particular, was expected to remain completely silent and motionless during their duties, like living statues protecting the crown. Commander Marcus had served the royal family for 20 years. He was a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes that he kept carefully hidden behind a mask of professional duty. Marcus had trained hundreds of guards over the years, teaching them the sacred rule: you are invisible until needed, silent until spoken to, and loyal until death. On this particular morning, Prince Alexander was walking through the West Corridor, a long hallway lined with portraits of former kings and queens. The corridor was always guarded by 2 soldiers who stood perfectly still for their entire 6-hour shift. As the prince approached, he noticed something unusual. Guard Thomas, a young soldier who had only been working at the palace for 3 months, was standing at his post as required. But something was wrong. The prince could see that Thomas was trying very hard not to move, but his left leg was shaking slightly. Sweat was forming on the young guard's forehead, and his face had turned pale. Prince Alexander stopped walking and studied the guard more carefully. He had seen this before when his own tutor had fallen ill during lessons. Thomas was clearly unwell, but the strict palace rules meant that he could not speak, could not move, and certainly could not abandon his post. The prince looked around the empty corridor. No other adults were present. His mind raced as he considered what to do. He had been taught that interfering with guard duties was strictly forbidden. Royal children were expected to pass by the guards as if they were simply part of the furniture. But Prince Alexander had always questioned these rules in his heart. He remembered a conversation he had overheard between his grandmother, the Queen Mother, and his father. She had told the king that true nobility came not from following rules blindly, but from knowing when compassion was more important than protocol. The prince made a decision that would echo through the palace for years to come. "Guard Thomas," he said softly, breaking the ancient silence that was supposed to exist between royalty and the palace guard. Thomas's eyes widened in surprise, but he remained at attention, staring straight ahead as he had been trained. Speaking to a guard directly was something that simply did not happen in Valdoria Palace. "I can see that you are not feeling well," Prince Alexander continued, his young voice carrying a gentleness that surprised even himself. "You do not need to respond. But I want you to know that I notice your dedication." The prince then did something that had never happened in the recorded history of Valdoria Palace. He walked to the small alcove nearby where an ornate chair sat beneath a window. The chair was meant for visiting dignitaries to rest while waiting for audiences with the king. Prince Alexander picked up the heavy chair and carried it over to where Thomas stood. "Please sit," the prince said, placing the chair directly behind the guard. "You can still watch the corridor and fulfill your duty, but you do not need to suffer while doing so." Thomas remained frozen, unsure of what to do. In his training, no one had ever prepared him for a situation where a member of the royal family showed direct concern for a guard's well-being. The rulebook simply did not cover this scenario. Prince Alexander could see the confusion and fear in the young guard's eyes. He understood that Thomas was caught between his duty to obey palace protocol and his duty to respect royal wishes. "I am ordering you, as a prince of this realm, to sit in this chair," Alexander said, using his royal authority for perhaps the first time in his life. "Your health serves the kingdom better than your suffering." Slowly, carefully, Thomas sat down in the chair. The relief on his face was immediate and obvious. The prince could see that the guard had been hiding a serious illness, probably a fever, and had been close to collapsing. "Thank you, Your Highness," Thomas whispered, breaking another sacred rule by speaking without being asked a direct question. Prince Alexander smiled and continued on his way down the corridor. He did not realize that this simple act of kindness had been witnessed by someone who would ensure that news of it spread throughout the entire palace. Lady Catherine, the head of palace housekeeping, had been cleaning a nearby room and had seen the entire exchange through a partially open door. Lady Catherine had worked in the palace for 30 years and had never seen anything like what she had just witnessed. Within an hour, every servant, guard, and staff member in Valdoria Palace had heard the story of how Prince Alexander had broken centuries of tradition to show compassion to a sick guard. The news spread through the kitchen, the stables, the gardens, and the guard quarters like wildfire. By the afternoon, the story had reached Commander Marcus, who found himself in an impossible position. On one hand, Guard Thomas had broken multiple rules by sitting during his shift and speaking to royalty. On the other hand, the prince himself had ordered these actions. The commander walked to the west corridor to investigate. When he arrived, he found Thomas still sitting in the chair, alert and watching the hallway, but clearly much more comfortable than he had been that morning. "Guard Thomas," Commander Marcus said in his official voice, "explain your current position." Thomas stood immediately and began to explain what had happened. As he spoke, the commander could see that the young guard was indeed ill and would likely have collapsed if he had continued standing for the remainder of his shift. Commander Marcus faced a dilemma that went to the very heart of palace tradition. The rules were clear, but the prince's compassion had actually prevented a potentially dangerous situation. A guard collapsing at his post would have been far worse than a guard sitting while remaining alert. As the afternoon progressed, more people became aware of what had happened. The story reached the palace tutors, the ministers, and eventually the senior staff who served directly under the king and queen. Prince Alexander, meanwhile, continued with his normal daily routine, seemingly unaware of the stir he had caused. He attended his mathematics lesson with Professor Williams, practiced his violin with the music teacher, and had lunch with his younger sister, Princess Isabella. It was only during his evening walk in the palace gardens that the prince began to understand the impact of his morning decision. As he passed various staff members, he noticed they were looking at him differently. Instead of the formal, distant nods he usually received, people seemed to be watching him with something that looked like respect and admiration. The head gardener, old William, actually spoke to him directly, which was highly unusual. "Your Highness," old William said, removing his hat, "I wanted to thank you for your kindness to young Thomas today. It means more than you know." Prince Alexander was surprised by this comment. He had not expected his small act of compassion to be noticed by so many people, let alone discussed throughout the palace. That evening, as Prince Alexander was preparing for dinner, his personal attendant, James, seemed nervous and excited about something. "Is everything well, James?" the prince asked. "Oh, yes, Your Highness," James replied. "It's just that everyone is talking about what you did today. The whole palace is buzzing with the story." Prince Alexander felt a mix of pride and worry. He was glad that his action had been seen as positive, but he wondered if he had caused problems for Guard Thomas or Commander Marcus. Dinner that evening was with his parents, King Frederick and Queen Eleanor, as was tradition every Tuesday. The dining hall was formal and elegant, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over the long mahogany table. As they ate, Prince Alexander waited for his parents to mention the incident with guard Thomas. He was prepared to explain his actions and accept whatever consequences might come. However, neither the king nor queen said anything about the events of the day. The conversation during dinner was typical for royal family meals. The king discussed matters of state, trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms, and upcoming royal ceremonies. The queen talked about her charitable work and her meetings with the wives of foreign ambassadors. Princess Isabella, who was 9 years old, chatted about her art lessons and her new pony. The meal proceeded normally, and Prince Alexander began to think that perhaps his parents had not yet heard about what had happened. It was only after dinner, as the family moved to the library for their evening reading time, that King Frederick finally addressed the situation. "Alexander," the king said, settling into his favorite leather chair, "I understand you had an interesting encounter with one of our guards today." Prince Alexander's heart began beating faster. He looked at his father's face, trying to read his expression, but the king's feelings were hidden behind his usual royal composure. "Yes, father," Prince Alexander replied honestly. "Guard Thomas appeared to be ill, so I provided him with a chair." Queen Eleanor looked up from her embroidery with interest. Princess Isabella continued reading her book, but Prince Alexander could tell she was listening to the conversation. "And what made you decide to take this action?" King Frederick asked. Prince Alexander thought carefully about his answer. He wanted to be truthful, but he also wanted to express his reasoning in a way that his father would understand. "I remembered what grandmother once told you about true nobility," the prince said. "She said it comes from compassion, not just from following rules. Thomas was suffering, and I had the power to help him without causing any real harm to his duties." King Frederick was quiet for a long moment. The only sound in the library was the crackling of the fireplace and the soft turning of pages as Princess Isabella continued reading. "Your grandmother was a wise woman," the king finally said. "But you must understand that your actions today have created quite a stir throughout the palace." Prince Alexander nodded, waiting to hear what consequences he might face. "The question now," King Frederick continued, "is what message your actions send to our staff and what precedent they set for future situations." The prince realized that his father was not necessarily angry, but was thinking through the larger implications of what had happened. This was how his father approached all problems, by considering every possible outcome and consequence. "I have been thinking about this all afternoon," the king said. "Your action was kind, and your motivation was pure. However, it also challenges traditions that have maintained order in this palace for hundreds of years." Queen Elena set down her embroidery and joined the conversation. "Alexander, your heart was in the right place, but you must understand that your position as prince means that everything you do is watched and interpreted by others." Prince Alexander felt a weight settle on his shoulders. For the first time, he truly understood that being royal meant that even small personal decisions could have far-reaching effects. "I did not mean to cause problems," he said quietly. "I only wanted to help." "I know," his father replied with a gentle smile, "and that desire to help others will serve you well when you become king someday. But you must learn to balance compassion with wisdom." The conversation continued for another hour, with his parents explaining the complexities of royal leadership and the importance of understanding how actions affect not just individuals, but entire institutions. As the evening came to an end and Prince Alexander prepared for bed, he reflected on the events of the day. He did not regret helping guard Thomas, but he now understood that his role as prince came with responsibilities he had never fully considered. In his room that night, as he lay in his bed looking up at the painted ceiling depicting scenes from Valdoria's history, Prince Alexander wondered what tomorrow would bring. He had no idea that his act of kindness was about to set in motion a series of events that would transform not just the palace, but the entire kingdom's understanding of what it meant to serve and to lead. The last thing he thought about before falling asleep was the look of relief and gratitude in Guard Thomas's eyes when he had finally been able to sit down. In that moment, Prince Alexander knew that regardless of any consequences, he had done the right thing. Outside his window, the palace continued its nightly routine. Guards changed shifts, servants completed their evening duties, and the ancient building settled into the quiet hours of darkness. But something had changed in Valdoria Palace that day. A young prince had chosen compassion over protocol, and that choice would soon echo through every hall, every room, and every heart within those historic walls. The next morning brought unexpected changes to Valdoria Palace that no one could have predicted. Word of Prince Alexander's kindness had traveled beyond the palace walls during the night, carried by servants who lived in the nearby village and guards who had families in the town. Commander Marcus arrived at the palace before dawn, as was his custom, but found something unusual waiting for him. On his desk was a formal letter bearing the seal of the Royal Council. The Council of Ministers, the group of advisors who helped the king make important decisions, had requested an immediate meeting to discuss recent irregularities in palace protocol. Marcus understood immediately what this meant. The incident with Prince Alexander and Guard Thomas had reached the highest levels of government, and now he would have to explain how he had handled the situation. At the same time, in the servants' quarters, a different kind of conversation was taking place. Cook Martha, who had been preparing meals in the palace kitchen for 15 years, was telling the other kitchen staff about something she had observed. "I've been watching the guards this morning," she said as she kneaded bread dough. "Something has changed. They seem more human somehow." What Cook Martha had noticed was true. The palace guards, who had always maintained their statue-like poses with rigid discipline, seemed different today. They still stood at attention and followed their duties perfectly, but there was something softer in their expressions. The act of kindness they had witnessed had reminded them that they were more than just uniformed decorations in the palace halls. Young Guard Thomas had reported for duty that morning despite still feeling unwell. He was determined to prove that Prince Alexander's kindness had not made him weak or unreliable. But as he stood at his post in the East Tower, he found himself thinking about the previous day in a way that surprised him. For the first time since joining the Royal Guard, Thomas felt truly valued. Not just as a uniform or a sword to protect the royal family, but as a person whose well-being mattered. This feeling was new and powerful, and it changed how he approached his duties. Meanwhile, Prince Alexander began his Wednesday morning routine unaware of the discussions taking place throughout the palace. His first lesson was history with Professor Reynolds, an elderly scholar who had been teaching royal children for 30 years. Professor Reynolds was a man who chose his words very carefully, especially when speaking about political matters. But today, he seemed unusually interested in discussing the topic of leadership and compassion in historical contexts. "Your Highness," the professor began, "today I thought we might examine how great leaders throughout history have balanced tradition with innovation." Prince Alexander found this topic more interesting than usual. As Professor Reynolds told stories about kings and queens who had changed their kingdoms through unexpected acts of kindness, the prince began to understand that his actions the previous day were part of a much larger pattern in human history. "Professor," Prince Alexander asked during the lesson, "have there been times when following tradition was actually harmful to people?" Professor Reynolds paused and looked at the young prince carefully. "That is a very thoughtful question, Your Highness. Yes, there have been many such times. The wisest leaders have always known when to honor tradition and when to create new traditions based on greater understanding." After his history lesson, Prince Alexander walked through the palace corridors as he did every morning. But today, he noticed something different in how the staff responded to him. Servants who usually gave quick, formal bows seemed to linger a moment longer, their faces showing warmth rather than just duty. The prince's route took him past the west corridor, where yesterday's events had taken place. As he approached, he saw Guard Thomas at his post again, standing alert and professional. But today, there was a sturdy wooden stool positioned discreetly behind Thomas, placed in such a way that it could be used if needed while remaining nearly invisible to casual observers. Prince Alexander realized that Commander Marcus must have made this arrangement. The commander had found a way to honor the prince's concern for his guards while maintaining the appearance of traditional protocol. This clever solution showed wisdom and flexibility that impressed the young prince. As Prince Alexander passed Thomas, the guard gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. It was barely noticeable, but it conveyed deep gratitude and respect. The prince smiled slightly and continued on his way, feeling that his actions had led to a positive change. However, not everyone in the palace viewed recent events positively. Lord Pemberton, the chief steward and head of palace administration, was deeply concerned about what he saw as a dangerous breakdown in proper order. Lord Pemberton had served in the palace for 25 years and believed firmly that the royal family's authority came from maintaining strict separation between rulers and subjects. In his view, Prince Alexander's kindness, while well-intentioned, threatened the very foundation of royal power. That afternoon, Lord Pemberton requested a private meeting with King Frederick. The chief steward's office was filled with thick books of palace regulations, charts showing the hierarchy of palace staff, and portraits of previous stewards who had maintained order for generations. "Your Majesty," Lord Pemberton began formally, "I must express my concerns about yesterday's incident involving Prince Alexander and the palace guard." King Frederick had been expecting this conversation. He gestured for the chief steward to sit down and prepared to listen to concerns he knew would be both valid and challenging. "I understand your position, Lord Pemberton," the king said. "Please share your thoughts freely." "Your Majesty, the palace functions smoothly because everyone understands their role and maintains proper boundaries. When those boundaries become unclear, chaos follows. What happens when every guard expects royal attention to their personal needs? What happens when servants begin to see themselves as equals to their superiors?" These were serious questions, and King Frederick recognized the wisdom in Lord Pemberton's concerns. The chief steward was not being cruel or heartless. He was protecting a system that had maintained stability for centuries. "What would you recommend?" the king asked. "I believe Prince Alexander should be instructed to issue a formal statement clarifying that his actions yesterday were exceptional circumstances, not to be repeated or expected in the future. This would preserve both his kindness and proper protocol." King Frederick considered this suggestion carefully. It would solve the immediate administrative concerns, but it might also send a message that compassion was less important than rules. This was exactly the kind of leadership dilemma that made kingship so challenging. While this conversation was taking place, Prince Alexander was having his afternoon mathematics lesson with Professor Williams. The prince found it difficult to concentrate on algebra problems when his mind kept returning to the events of the previous day and their aftermath. Professor Williams noticed his student's distraction. "Your Highness, you seem preoccupied today. Is there something troubling you?" Prince Alexander hesitated, then decided to speak honestly. "Professor, if you knew that doing the right thing might cause problems for other people, would you still do it?" Professor Williams set down his chalk and looked at the young prince thoughtfully. "That is not a mathematics question, Your Highness, but it is perhaps the most important question any leader must answer." "What do you think the answer is?" Prince Alexander asked. "I think," Professor Williams said carefully, "that the right action is usually the right action, regardless of temporary complications." But a wise leader also considers how to minimize those complications for others. This conversation gave Prince Alexander much to think about. He began to realize that his concern should not just be whether his action had been right, but how he could help ensure that others did not suffer negative consequences because of his decision. That evening, an unexpected event occurred that would change everything. As the palace staff was finishing their dinner in the servants' hall, a messenger arrived with news from the village. The story of Prince Alexander's kindness to guard Thomas had spread throughout the town and surrounding countryside. But as the story traveled, it had grown and changed, becoming something larger than the simple act of providing a chair to a sick guard. People in the village were calling it the day the prince saw us. They interpreted the prince's action as a sign that the royal family was beginning to truly care about the common people, not just rule over them. More importantly, the story had inspired others. A wealthy merchant had decided to provide better working conditions for his shop assistants. A landowner had built a shelter where his field workers could rest during the hottest part of the day. A tavern keeper had started providing free meals to travelers who could not afford to pay. The messenger who brought this news was old Henrik, a man who had been carrying messages between the palace and village for 40 years. Henrik requested an immediate audience with the king, claiming he had urgent information about public sentiment. King Frederick received Henrik in his private study, a room lined with maps of the kingdom and reports from his administrators. Queen Elena joined them, sensing that this conversation might be important for understanding the broader impact of their son's actions. "Your Majesty," Henrik began, "I have lived in this kingdom all my life, and I have never seen the people respond to royal news the way they have responded to this story about Prince Alexander." "Explain what you mean," Queen Elena requested. "The people are not just talking about the prince's kindness, Your Majesty, they are acting on it. All across the village, people are treating each other better, helping each other more, showing compassion where there was only duty before." King Frederick and Queen Elena exchanged glances. This was far beyond what they had expected from such a small incident. "There is more, Your Majesty," Henrik continued. "The people are asking questions about other royal policies. They want to know if this kindness represents a new direction for the kingdom. They are hopeful in a way I have never seen before." This news presented both opportunity and challenge for the royal family. On one hand, inspiring positive behavior throughout the kingdom was exactly what good leadership should accomplish. On the other hand, raised expectations from the people would require careful management to avoid disappointment or unrest. That night, after Prince Alexander had gone to bed, King Frederick and Queen Elena had a long conversation in their private chambers. They walked on the balcony overlooking the palace gardens, discussing the implications of what their son had set in motion. "Frederick," Queen Elena said, "I think we are witnessing something important. Alexander's natural compassion may be showing us a new way to connect with our people." "I agree," the king replied, "but we must be careful. We cannot change centuries of tradition overnight without causing instability. Yet we also cannot ignore the positive response this has generated." They decided to seek counsel from the Queen Mother, King Frederick's mother, who had ruled as regent for several years before Frederick came of age. The Queen Mother was known throughout the kingdom for her wisdom and her ability to see the long-term consequences of political decisions. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Commander Marcus was having his own difficult conversations. Several of his senior guards had approached him with questions about how they should respond to royal kindness. They wanted to know if the old rules still applied, and if so, how they should handle future situations where those rules might conflict with royal compassion. "Commander," asked Captain Rodriguez, a veteran guard who had served for 15 years, "what do we do if Prince Alexander shows us kindness again? Do we follow protocol or royal wishes?" Marcus had been thinking about this exact question all day. "We serve the royal family," he answered carefully. That means we follow their wishes while maintaining our duty to protect them. If those two things ever conflict, we must use our best judgment to honor both." This answer satisfied Captain Rodriguez. But it also highlighted how much complexity Prince Alexander's simple act of kindness had introduced into the palace's daily operations. As midnight approached, the palace grew quiet, but sleep came slowly to many residents that night. In their rooms, guards wondered about their changing role. Servants discussed whether they might dare to hope for better treatment. Ministers worried about maintaining order, and royal family members contemplated the balance between tradition and progress. In the guard quarters, Thomas lay in his bed thinking about how dramatically his life had changed in just 2 days. He had gone from being an invisible protector to being the center of a story that was inspiring people throughout the kingdom. The responsibility of that role felt both exciting and frightening. In his own room, Prince Alexander was also awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the complexity of leadership that he was just beginning to understand. He had wanted to help one person, but his action had affected hundreds of people in ways he never could have imagined. The young prince realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions. He wondered if he was wise enough to handle the responsibility that seemed to be growing around him. But one thing he knew for certain: he did not regret showing kindness to guard Thomas. Whatever complications arose, that action had been right, and he would face the consequences with the same courage that had led him to help someone in need. As the palace finally settled into sleep, change continued to ripple outward like waves from a stone dropped into still water. By morning, the story of the prince's compassion would reach neighboring kingdoms. Foreign ambassadors would ask questions about Valdoria's new approach to leadership, and Prince Alexander would face the first real test of whether kindness could indeed be a form of strength, not weakness, in the complex world of royal responsibility. 3 weeks after Prince Alexander's act of kindness, Valdoria Palace had become the center of attention for kingdoms across the continent. Foreign ambassadors, curious about reports of a new style of royal leadership, requested audiences with King Frederick. Neighboring rulers wanted to understand how such a small gesture had generated such widespread positive change. The Queen Mother, Lady Margaret, had spent those 3 weeks carefully observing the effects of her grandson's actions. Now, 92 years old, she had lived through the reigns of 3 kings and understood better than anyone how royal decisions could shape entire generations. On a crisp Thursday morning, Lady Margaret requested a private breakfast with Prince Alexander in her personal chambers. Her rooms were filled with comfortable furniture, family portraits, and books collected over decades of thoughtful leadership. "My dear Alexander," she began as they sat at a small table beside tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, "I believe it is time we discussed what you have accomplished." Prince Alexander had been wondering when this conversation would happen. He respected his grandmother's wisdom more than anyone else's, and her opinion would help him understand whether he had acted properly. "Grandmother, I only wanted to help guard Thomas. I never expected everything that followed." Lady Margaret smiled warmly. "The best leaders rarely do, Alexander. They act from their hearts and discover later that their hearts were wiser than their minds." She poured tea for both of them and continued, "But you must understand the full scope of what has happened. Your kindness did not just help one guard. It reminded an entire kingdom that compassion and strength can exist together." Over the past weeks, reports had been arriving daily from throughout Valdoria about positive changes inspired by the prince's example. Villages were organizing community assistance programs. Noble families were improving conditions for their servants. Merchants were treating their workers with greater respect and fairness. However, Lady Margaret continued, "your father faces a delicate situation. He must find a way to honor your compassionate instincts while maintaining the stability that comes from clear traditions and expectations." Prince Alexander nodded, understanding that leadership required balancing many competing concerns simultaneously. What would you do, grandmother, if you were still queen? Lady Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking out at the gardens where gardeners were tending to the autumn flowers with obvious care and pride. I would create new traditions, she said finally. Not to replace the old ones entirely, but to show that royal authority can evolve while remaining strong. That afternoon, King Frederick called a meeting that would change the future of Valdoria. Present were Queen Elena, Prince Alexander, the Queen Mother, Commander Marcus, Lord Pemberton, and the full Royal Council of Ministers. The meeting took place in the Grand Chamber, a formal room used for the most important royal decisions. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the polished wood table where Valdoria's leaders sat. We are here today, King Frederick began, to address the changes that have occurred in our palace and kingdom over the past weeks. We must decide how to move forward in a way that honors both tradition and the positive developments we have witnessed. Lord Pemberton was the first to speak. Your Majesty, while I acknowledge the good intentions behind recent events, I remain concerned about maintaining proper order and hierarchy. Commander Marcus nodded respectfully to the chief steward, then addressed the king. Your Majesty, I have observed my guards over these past weeks. Their discipline remains excellent, but their morale and dedication have improved significantly. They serve with greater pride because they feel valued as individuals, not just as uniformed positions. This was an important observation. The king had been particularly concerned about maintaining the effectiveness of the palace guard, as their protection was essential to royal security. Queen Eleanor spoke next. I have been corresponding with the wives of foreign ambassadors, and they report that Valdoria's reputation for enlightened leadership has grown considerably. Several kingdoms are asking about our methods for inspiring positive behavior among our people. The Queen Mother, despite her advanced age, commanded immediate attention when she chose to speak. Frederick, in my experience, the strongest kingdoms are those where rulers and subjects understand that they serve each other. Alexander has reminded us of this fundamental truth. Prince Alexander had been listening carefully to each speaker, understanding that this conversation would determine not just his own future actions, but the direction of the entire kingdom. When his father asked him to share his thoughts, the young prince chose his words carefully. Father, I believe that showing concern for others makes us stronger, not weaker. But I also understand that change must happen in a way that maintains stability. Perhaps we could create official ways to show that the royal family cares about our people's well-being. King Frederick had been considering exactly this possibility. Over the past weeks, he and Queen Elena had developed a plan that would address both the enthusiasm generated by Alexander's kindness and the practical concerns raised by their advisors. I propose, the king announced, that we establish new royal traditions that formalize our commitment to the well-being of those who serve our kingdom. The plan he outlined was both innovative and respectful of existing structures. First, the palace would institute regular wellness checks for all staff, ensuring that guards, servants, and administrators could receive help when needed without breaking protocol. Second, Prince Alexander would be given an official role as royal advocate for palace staff, allowing him to address concerns and suggest improvements in working conditions. This would channel his compassionate instincts into constructive action while giving him valuable leadership experience. Third, the kingdom would establish an annual day of service, when members of the royal family would work alongside common citizens on community projects. This would demonstrate that leadership meant service, not just authority. Lord Pemberton was initially skeptical, but found that he could support these changes because they created official procedures rather than random departures from protocol. Commander Marcus was enthusiastic because the changes would improve the effectiveness of his guards while maintaining their discipline. The Royal Council voted unanimously to approve these new traditions, recognizing that they represented evolution rather than revolution in royal leadership. 2 months later, the first day of service was held throughout Valdoria. Prince Alexander worked alongside villagers to build a new bridge over the stream that connected two farming communities. King Frederick and Queen Elena helped organize food distribution for families facing difficult times. Even Princess Isabella, despite her young age, helped plant trees in the royal gardens that would provide shade for future generations. The sight of the royal family working with their hands alongside common people created powerful images that spread far beyond Valdoria's borders. Foreign visitors were impressed by a monarchy that demonstrated strength through service rather than distance. Guard Thomas, whose illness had started this chain of events, had recovered completely and been promoted to training officer for new recruits. His job was to teach incoming guards that their duty included both protecting the royal family and upholding the highest standards of honor and compassion. In his training sessions, Thomas would tell new guards about the day Prince Alexander had shown him kindness, but he always emphasized that the real lesson was about the courage to do the right thing, even when it meant breaking established patterns. The prince saw that following rules blindly would have caused harm, Thomas would explain. A good guard thinks about the purpose behind the rules and finds ways to fulfill that purpose even in unexpected situations. Commander Marcus observed these training sessions with satisfaction. He had discovered that guards who understood the importance of compassion were actually more effective at their protective duties because they developed stronger loyalty to the royal family and deeper understanding of their mission. The changes instituted by King Frederick had effects that extended far beyond the palace walls. Villages throughout Valdoria began organizing their own days of service. Noble families started visiting their lands regularly to ensure that their tenants were being treated fairly. Merchants established standards for worker treatment that became models for neighboring kingdoms. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their own rulers about Valdoria's innovative approach to royal leadership. Some kingdoms began implementing similar reforms, creating a gradual shift toward more compassionate governance throughout the region. Prince Alexander, now 13 years old and carrying the official title of Royal Advocate for Palace Staff, had grown considerably in wisdom and confidence. He had learned that kindness required not just good intentions, but also careful thought about how to implement change without causing unintended harm. His weekly meetings with palace staff members had become some of the most important gatherings in the royal schedule. Guards, servants, cooks, gardeners, and administrators could bring concerns directly to someone in authority who would listen carefully and work to find solutions. These meetings had revealed many small problems that, when addressed, improved both working conditions and overall palace efficiency. For example, adjusting guard shift schedules reduced fatigue-related mistakes. Improving kitchen ventilation made food preparation safer and more comfortable. Providing better lighting in the stables prevented accidents and made horse care easier. Each improvement demonstrated that caring for people's well-being was not just morally right, but also practically beneficial for the kingdom's operations. On the first anniversary of the incident with Guard Thomas, Prince Alexander was walking through the West Corridor when he noticed something that made him smile. The ornate chair he had carried to help Thomas was still there, positioned discreetly in the alcove. But now it was joined by similar chairs placed throughout the palace wherever guards stood for long periods. These chairs had become symbols of Valdoria's new approach to leadership. They reminded everyone that strength and compassion could coexist, that caring for others was a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. Commander Marcus approached the prince as he stood looking at the chair that had started everything. "Your Highness," the commander said, "I wanted to thank you again for what you did that day. But more importantly, I wanted you to know what your example has taught all of us." "What is that, Commander?" You showed us that true leadership means seeing people as they really are, not just as the roles they fill. Every guard under my command is better at their job because they know their well-being matters to the royal family they protect." Prince Alexander felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because he had been praised, but because he understood that his simple act of kindness had grown into something much larger and more lasting. As he continued his walk through the palace, the prince reflected on everything he had learned over the past year. Leadership was indeed complex, requiring balance between many competing concerns. But at its foundation, good leadership was about serving others and creating conditions where everyone could contribute their best efforts. The incident with guard Thomas had taught him that small acts of compassion could have enormous consequences. But it had also taught him that those consequences came with responsibility. Once he had shown that a different way of leading was possible, he had to work continuously to make that way sustainable and beneficial for everyone involved. That evening, as Prince Alexander prepared for bed, he looked out his window at the palace grounds. Guards walked their routes with the confident bearing of people who knew their service was valued. Servants moved through their duties with the efficiency that came from being treated with respect. Gardeners tended the grounds with the care of people who took pride in their work. The palace looked the same as it had a year ago, but everything had changed. The change had started with one moment of kindness, but it had grown because many people had chosen to embrace the idea that strength and compassion could work together. Prince Alexander understood now that his future role as king would not be about ruling over people, but about creating conditions where everyone in his kingdom could live with dignity and contribute to the common good. This was a much more challenging vision of leadership than simply following ancient traditions, but it was also much more rewarding. As he fell asleep that night, Prince Alexander thought about the lessons he would teach his own children someday. He would tell them that true nobility came not from being born into privilege, but from using that privilege to serve others. He would teach them that the strongest kingdoms were built not on fear or blind obedience, but on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. Most importantly, he would teach them that sometimes the most important thing a leader could do was to see one person who needed help and have the courage to provide it, even if doing so meant challenging traditions that had existed for centuries. The young prince had learned that change begins with individual acts of kindness, but it becomes lasting only when those acts inspire others to create new and better traditions. In Valdoria Palace, on a morning when a sick guard needed help, and a young prince chose compassion over protocol, a new chapter in the kingdom's history had begun. Years later, when Prince Alexander became King Alexander the Compassionate, historians would point to that morning as the moment when Valdoria transformed from a kingdom ruled by tradition into a kingdom guided by wisdom and mercy. But King Alexander himself would always remember it simply as the day he learned that seeing others clearly and caring for their well-being was not just the right thing to do, but the foundation of all meaningful leadership. The chair in the West Corridor remained there for generations, a quiet reminder that the greatest acts of leadership often begin with the smallest gestures of human kindness.